let's go into the backstory of fat here, and let's just find out the what, when, how, where of fat. And I'm going to do it really quickly for you. And simply, we basically have two different types of fats: the saturated and the unsaturated fats. And quite simply, you can draw a line down the middle here, and on this upper side, you're going to have the fats coming from mainly from animal sources, and also they're solid at room temperature. And they're very opposite when it comes to the unsaturated fats, which are mainly coming from your plant sources, and they are liquid at room temperature. So, your saturated fat, you would find it as being the marble in the steak, for example, the fat marble. You would also find unsaturated fats in something like as common as olive oil or canola oil, again, coming from a plant source. And, the marble is solid in that steak, and the olive oil is a liquid when they're at room temperature. That's a really easy way to decipher the difference between the saturated and the unsaturated fats. Now, there's also these essential fatty acids, which have become quite popular in the last decade or so as well. And you've probably heard about this one in particular, the omega-3. And it's mainly coming from seafood sources, fish primarily. Salmon is the one that's talked about most. There's also the omega-6. They're not talked about as much, but it's also essential. And essential means essentially you need to get these outside, okay, of your body. They can't be produced internally. So you need to get them from food sources. And they're essential for our health. And again, they're omega-3s and omega-6. And the difference is, one's coming mainly from the sea, and the other, again, is coming from vegetable or plant sources. And you'll find them in oils, nuts, and seeds. Now, quickly going into the ugly story about fat, and this was something they've been talking about probably for 20 years as well, is the trans fats. So you probably see this on a lot of food labeling now, no trans fats, and you're probably really impressed with that, but I want you to understand why you should be really impressed. In fact, you should be relieved about this, because what trans fats are is hydrogenated vegetable oil. And what that means basically is that they've artificially hydrogenated these certain types of vegetable oils, like palm oil is a very common one. And just let me show you a couple of examples here. This is a favorite snack of mine, eating the all-inclusive diet, of course, so I do so sparingly in single serving size. Thank goodness for whoever invented single servings, right? This is definitely a blessing for me. But let's look at the ingredients here, and one of the things that I see is the modified palm oil. So what that basically means, and we also have shortening here as well. And what that means, again, is that the hand of man has went in and modified this and hydrogenated it. So now a liquid becomes a solid, and that solid is what they can put into this food for all of the different reasons, which we'll talk about in a moment here. But it comes in lots of different forms. It even comes in another one of my favorite treats. Recognize this one? Isn't this like every kid's favorite treat? Nutella. And if you look at the ingredients here, you'll find out that it also contains modified palm oil. And you'll see that as a very common modified oil or hydrogenated oil or a trans fat. And basically, you're going to find them in all your baking products, pastries, for example. And that's because they put this shortening in. And shortening is basically a vegetable oil that is now solid. In fact, I remember working in restaurants, and before I got into the fitness business, I worked in many, many different restaurants. And in the kitchen, in the fryers, we used to have to put in the shortening. I'll never forget it because it was such a strange thing. You put in this big blob of white stuff. It was like literally a brick that we had to throw into the fryer, and it melted and turned into a liquid. And what was happening back then, and I hope it's not really happening today, I know it's not happening in the commercial restaurants and fast food chains, but maybe in the mom and pop shops, we were leaving that oil in for way too long. And I know now that it definitely was going rancid. And rancid basically means that it's breaking down and it's going bad, and it causes a lot of issues, a lot of inflammatory response issues in our body. It can cause a lot of atherosclerosis and heart disease and a lot of different sort of vascular problems. And that was something that is really common because there was, back then there was a lot of fried foods using this shortening or this trans fat. So it is really harmful for our health, and it's something that you definitely want to avoid. And it's going to come in, modified palm oil, modified corn oil. You got to look out for it. Sometimes, it'll be called shortening as well, but it's never anything that you want to put in any great quantities anyways in your diet. So why do we need dietary fat anyways? We need it because there's certain vitamins, E, D, and K, that are fat soluble, all right? They're not water soluble like vitamin C, for example. So they need this fat, okay, this dietary fat, in order to be absorbed. And they're really important. Vitamin E, for example, has a lot of antioxidant effects you may know of. So it's a really important vitamin that really can only be transported through the cell membrane by dietary fat. So that's why we really need to have dietary fat in our diet. Cell production, so most of our cells, our cell membranes, are created by dietary fat. So just for healthy cell generation and regeneration, as we're getting a little bit older here, for example, we definitely need some regeneration, right? So that's what it helps us with. Also hormone production. So the sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, are really, they're basically created by cholesterol. Testosterone is, for example, and we need to have some dietary fat in order to have the hormone production we're looking for. Brain function, the dietary fat is really important for our nervous system. You look at our nervous system and the neurons and then the sheaths and the axioms and all these different parts of our nervous system, they're all covered with fat membranes. So it's really important for our nervous system and also for our later on nervous system. As we get older and doing a lot of research on Alzheimer's, for example, and other different type of inflammatory responses that attack our nervous system, and that's why we really need some of these essential fats in order to get good brain function. And it does make us smarter. It really does. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. Immune system. So if we have enough dietary fat, usually our immune system is strong as well. And that's the other thing that I noticed when I was on my low-fat diet is I had a lot of sickness. I wasn't well during those periods, especially after my shows, and also inflammation. I was a mess. I was breaking down. Signs of osteoarthritis, in a young 20-year-old's body. It was very, very strange, those type of side effects. But now I know it was because of my low-fat diet. So what do we also need it for? We need it for us. We need it for our pleasure, okay? We're pleasure-seeking creatures, us human beings, and we need it for taste, texture, and satiety. So fat's really what gives us the taste in our mouth. It also gives us the texture, that smooth texture that makes our food taste so good. If you know this product here, you know what I'm talking about. It's tasty, it's got tons of texture to it. In limited quantities, of course, like 1 tablespoon once in a while, that's it. Satiety, the feeling of feeling full, which that's a really important feeling because when we're full, then we can, close the fridge, close the pantry, and not get ourselves into trouble with food by overeating. So that's why we need dietary fat. Now, how much dietary fat do we need? Now, this is going to change with opinion, and there's lots of opinions out there. I know that my sort of recommendation way back then of 5% of total dietary fat is not what I'm going to recommend tonight. It's a little bit higher than that. Typically, we recommend 20 to 35% dietary fat of total calories. Now, that would equal 40 to 70 grams, okay, on a typical 1,600 to a 2,000 calorie diet, or a typical female to a male, respectively, diet. Now, in order to do this, it's pretty simple math. It's a fat formula. What you do is you take your total grams and you times it by 9 calories. Now, this is important, this number right here. So for every gram of fat, it is 9 calories. Now, I don't know if that means much to you, but let's compare it to something else that you're familiar with. Carbohydrates and protein. They are 4 calories. So fat is double, okay? So you can imagine that calories add up quite quickly, all right? And that's why we want to make sure that we use fat in our diet, you know, if it's going to be coming in forms of butter or oils, you know, with our cooking or putting it on our salad, we want to use moderation as a practice. Because if we don't, you can imagine that this will add up quite quickly. And calories do count, right? Although fat is in fashion right now, they're telling us to have more fat. Of course, if we have too much fat, well, hey, it's got to go somewhere. If we ingest it, it just doesn't turn into thin air, right? So it's got to be burned or it's going to be stored. That's really the 2 options that fat has when it enters our system. So unless you're really highly active, we want to make sure that it's a reasonable amount of total fat in a percentage, 20 to 35% or 40 to 70 grams in total.